Madam Speaker, I rise today to table the ACT Government response to the April 2001 ACT Legislative Assembly resolution regarding regulation and access to Assisted Reproductive Technology, or ART, in the ACT. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr Paterson for bringing this important and substantive motion to the Assembly. Dr Paterson's passion and advocacy in this space will lead to substantial reform here and ensure that people who donate or receive gametes, deliver ART services and are born as a result of these services will have far greater confidence because of her work. ART gives many people the chance to have children that they may not otherwise have had. ART is used for a range of different reasons to help a diversity of people achieve pregnancy. Historically, ART has primarily been used as an infertility treatment in heterosexual relationships. However, it is increasingly being used by people of a range of genders, sexualities and family structures. ART can also be used to help reduce the risk of a genetic disease or abnormality being inherited by a child. For many single people and people in same-sex or gender-diverse couples, ART may be their only option for becoming parents. The government response table today outlines the next steps for the ACT government. We will work to develop a regulatory framework for ART in the ACT, including establishing a register for donor information in consultation with stakeholders. Explore options for increasing affordability and accessibility of ART, including a potential low-cost ART service in the ACT. Work with the Commonwealth Government to explore opportunities to improve access to specialised support or counselling services for donor-conceived people and their families. Advocate to the Commonwealth Government to expand the eligibility criteria for accessing Medicare rebates to include people accessing ART treatment due to social infertility. Encourage ART providers to expand availability of counselling appointments and to offer counselling at no cost where it is not already. Counselling and support services should be focused on the well-being of the individual and the rights of the donor-conceived child rather than the ART process, and should be culturally appropriate and inclusive. Encourage all ART clinics to undertake LGBTIQ+ cultural competency training and to use inclusive and gender-neutral language in ART treatment and practice. Encourage ART providers to promote access to peer support networks. Implementing these next steps will help ensure equity amongst all cohorts wishing to access ART. It will help ensure that adequate support is provided for all who are involved in an ART process and will be considerate of the needs of donor-conceived people. In the ACT, ART is available through private service providers. While some ART costs are covered through either Medicare rebates or private health insurance, I acknowledge that there are still significant out-of-pocket costs associated with accessing ART. Cost was one of the most widely raised issues by consumers as a barrier to accessing ART services, and we heard that some people travel to New South Wales to access the low-cost options there. The ACT Government will explore options to improve affordability and accessibility of ART so that cost is not such a barrier and people can receive care close at home. Eligibility for Medicare rebates was commonly discussed as a barrier to the accessibility and affordability of ART, particularly for LGBTIQ+ Canberrans who seek to access ART services. Although Medicare is the responsibility of the Commonwealth Government, the ACT Government is supportive of equity in access to Medicare rebates for ART and will advocate for this. For people considering accessing ART services, support services are available to assist in the decision-making process. Counselling is currently mandatory for ART that involves the use of donor gametes. Any person who accesses ART, however, should be offered counselling by an appropriately trained and experienced professional. We heard that when accessing support and counselling services for ART, people had mixed experiences. While many people told us about their positive experiences, there were still individuals who had difficult or negative experiences. Some LGBTIQ+ consumers indicated that some ART providers have a limited understanding of the LGBTIQ+ fertility and care needs. Other people told us of varying experiences with counselling provided by ART clinics, with some finding it helpful, whereas others found it distressing. Some people were unable to access counselling due to limited availability. As I've noted, the government's view is that counselling and support services should be focused on the wellbeing of the individual rather than the ART process, and should be culturally appropriate and inclusive. For these reasons, we will encourage ART providers to expand availability of counselling appointments and to promote access to peer support services. We also heard that there is limited specialist support or counselling services for donor-conceived people and their families. We will work with the Commonwealth Government to explore opportunities to ensure these services are readily available. These services should centre around the rights and needs of donor-conceived people, both when they are children and as adults. Unfortunately, we heard that some clinicians and services appear to be uninformed about the fertility needs of LGBTIQ+ people, although this experience varied across different services. We will encourage all ART clinics to undertake LGBTIQ+ cultural competency training and to use inclusive and gender-neutral language in their practice. The regulation and oversight of ART clinics and the extent to which ART is regulated varies throughout Australia, and there is currently no Commonwealth legislation that directly regulates ART. The ACT also does not have specific legislation that regulates ART. There have been various government inquiries at federal and jurisdictional levels that have considered introducing regulation for ART and the merits of establishing registers for donor-conceived gametes. Further, following these inquiries, some state governments have progressively introduced legislation to regulate ART. Based on our research and feedback from stakeholders, there is a real need to include a specific regulatory framework for ART in the ACT. This includes the establishment of a central register for donor gametes. I intend to have legislation introduced in 2023 reflecting the critical need identified in the government's response. We acknowledge the importance of accessing information and the impact this can have on the sense of identity of donor-conceived people. We will explore opportunities to ensure that donor-conceived people are appropriately supported to learn about their genetic origins and access information about siblings and relatives if they choose to. We value the views of our stakeholders. The development of a regulatory framework will include significant consultation with the community and will have a specific regard to the impacts and needs of donor-conceived people, donors and LGBTIQ+ Canberrans. This response explores how regulation and access to ART services in the ACT can be improved. However, I acknowledge significant further work is required to begin to implement these next steps. Ongoing stakeholder consultation will be a key component to progressing this work. In closing, I would like to thank Women's Health Matters for undertaking a public survey to explore the experiences of Canberrans who have had difficulty getting pregnant or becoming a parent. This work was invaluable in its contribution to the ACT government response. I'd also like to thank the stakeholders and consumers who generously shared their stories and perspectives about access to and regulation of ART in the ACT. I want to recognise and thank everyone who has and will contribute to this process. And in particular, Madam Speaker, I want to thank Donor Conceived Australia and those who came and spoke directly to me about their experiences. Some very difficult but very important stories to hear. Trying to get pregnant or become a parent via ART can be an immensely challenging but also an immensely rewarding experience for individuals, their families and loved ones. For an adult, learning you have been conceived via ART and having limited or no knowledge of your heritage and siblings can have significant negative impact on wellbeing. I want to recognise again and thank those stakeholders and community members for their generosity in contributing to improve these experiences. Madam Speaker, I present a copy of my statement and the government response and move that the Assembly take note of the paper.
The question is that that motion is agreed. Dr Paterson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would first like to thank Minister Stephen Smith and her team for this response to my motion regarding the regulatory framework of Assisted Reproductive Technology, or ART, in the ACT. I'm incredibly pleased to see indications from the Minister that creating an ACT regulatory framework, including a donor register, is a priority, with hopes of legislation being introduced next year. Developing this framework requires a substantial amount of work to ensure the concerns of donor-conceived people and the needs of donor recipients are addressed. But I do stress there is an urgency to this. Until there is a register in the ACT, donor-conceived people have very little rights. Shortly after being elected, it came to my attention there was no legislative or regulatory framework. Earlier this year, I was contacted by a major group of stakeholders who came into my life and this was donor-conceived people themselves. I was contacted by Donor Conceived Australia, a newly established group that represents donor-conceived people. Listening to these people telling their stories truly opened my eyes. These were stories of immense pain, emotional anguish, and fractured identity. I cannot express my empathy and compassion enough for the people I've been working with. One of these people was Anastasia, who has given me permission to share her story with you today. This is Anastasia's story, and these are her words. My name is Anastasia. I'm in my 30s, and I found out I was donor conceived 4 years ago in 2018. I was born in Canberra in the early 90s. When I was 6 years old, my mother divorced from her husband, the man who I'd been told was my father, whom I never saw or heard from again. In 2018, I'd been speaking with a sibling who had contacted our estranged dad and had mentioned that I was a donor-conceived person. While hearing this story, I initially laughed it off, because to me, it was a story that sounded so far-fetched and unrealistic. While relaying this story over the phone to my mum, I found out the truth of how I came to be alive. I was 26 years old. I remember that night so vividly, a memory that is so uncomfortable and 4 years later still feels impossible to successfully emotionally navigate. I can still feel the silence over the phone, and I still hear the loudness of my mother repeating, "Please don't hate me, please don't hate me, please don't hate me." I still feel empty. I was in shock, and I am still in shock 4 years on. I am a donor-conceived person. My mother sought out this option when it was made aware that the man she married could not have children. My mother engaged in IVF treatment through a Canberra doctor who was told at the time to keep it a secret. I would like to highlight that keeping such a secret from a child is wrong. I would give for anything to know the origins of my life as a little girl. 4 years later, my relationship with my mother is strained. For long periods of time, I could not speak to her. Personally, I have wanted to hear her simply say that she lied to me, and this has not happened yet. Processing this information as an adult has been tremendously hard. I have no psychological support. I don't even know where to turn to. I'm scared to tap into the feelings of hurt because they wipe me out emotionally for weeks at a time. I have felt sadness about my existence and my place on this earth. I have felt like a secret experiment and less of a human being. Even though feeling these emotions, I still have so many questions. Who is my father? Was he a good man? Do I look like him? What is his background? Is he healthy? Do I have brothers and sisters? These questions consume my mind every single day. I contacted the IVF clinic to find my biological father. The clinic took 2 weeks to find my mother's file, and the only information they would provide was a piece of paper that had details of my donor's blood type, eye colour, hair colour, and if the donor had any children. I was told that any other information about my donor was confidential. My mental health began to suffer, and I felt like there was a lack of support on where to go or who to talk to. I began to join groups on Facebook, and I tried to research on the internet. But all of this became too much to handle. I made the decision to pay for an American DNA ancestry test in the off chance that I might connect with a relative or to find out something about my genetic history. I was matched to a first cousin who was extremely helpful and put me in contact with his uncle, my donor. On the night that I found out I was donor conceived, my mum let out a giggle with a tone of worry when she said, "You have no idea how many times I would pray that you would never have a relationship with a brother." I felt sick. I wanted to recall every single sexual relationship I have ever had and the possibility that they could be a brother. I figured that none of my long-term boyfriends were, but the short-term one-night stands I will never know. In 2020, I received a new message from a person through Ancestry.com. This person wrote to me that they were very confused about our DNA match. It showed that we were closely related, possibly first cousins or siblings. But I was confused. When I had connected with my biological father, he had reached out to the clinic to find out how many children had come from his donation. The clinic had told him there was just one successful birth of a child, and we assumed that was me. But through this new ancestry match, it became clear that the clinic had no accurate data at all. This person and I were in fact brother and sister. I was the first person to tell Daniel that he was my brother and that he was donor conceived. This was a secret that was kept from him for 30 years. When I first met my brother Daniel, we began to connect some very scary dots. I had a sexual relationship with one of his best friends. The degree of separation was concerning. Daniel and I are 2 years apart. 4 years later, I am on edge as I realise that there may be many more brothers or sisters of mine out there. There are so many gaps in this space and much support is needed to help with mental health, parental support, rights to access medical history and avoidance of conversationist relationships. These are concerns I have as donor-conceived person born in the 90s. I hope that no future donor-conceived persons will ever have to worry about this in the future. I would like to thank Anastasia for allowing me to share her story here today. I've heard so many stories like Anastasia, all from the ACT, and all of which deeply impacted me. They made it clear in my mind that we have so much work to do and it needs to happen promptly to protect people who are born today from this same pain. Again, I'm very glad to see the response that the ministerial statement and report that was delivered today by the Minister. I would again like to thank Donor Conceived Australia, as well as the many donor conceived people and parents and donor recipients who spoke to Minister Stephen Smith and myself. I'm excited to take these next steps with the Minister and stakeholders to create some excellent outcomes for the ACT community. Thank you.